Awesome. How are you today?
Very good, very good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm
Good.
very grateful for your time and willingness to do this.
No, that's it's my pleasure. It's kind of a topic of mine that I'm into as well. So it's interesting to talk about it and bring more angles for people, right?
Right.
Into the space and stuff. So yeah, happy to discuss and talk and awesome.
I so appreciate it. All right, so what I'm going to do is start by giving you a much more formal and thorough introduction to let our viewers know who you are. And I'm also going to give a little bit of a mention of how I found you and what a fortuitous day it was for me because your information is really so important and I feel like it really needs to be shared with a wider audience.
Okay.
So Niki is an award-winning nutritional therapist. She is a bioenergetic practitioner and a mind-body expert, helping people to optimize energy. In 2005, Niki co-founded one of the largest mind-body clinics in integrative medicine in the UK, with patients in 35 countries, where she worked as a director of nutrition until 2010. The clinic specialized in treating chronic fatigue syndrome /ME. The results with patients at the clinic on the nutrition protocol she designed were later published as a preliminary study in 2012 in the British medical journal Open. In August, and we're going to provide a link to that, in August 2015, she hosted the largest ever online health summit on overcoming fatigue, interviewing 29 world-leading experts on optimizing energy with over 30,000 attendees. Niki has spoken on over 20 online health summits and been the keynote speaker at live conferences internationally. So you get the idea why I am so excited. So just real quick, how I found Niki. So as many of you know, I have been struggling with narcissistic abuse, especially over the last year, having gone through multiple betrayals and really getting into my healing journey and having realized that most likely many of my behaviors have roots in childhood trauma. That's how I was able to find Niki. And it was primarily actually because the link between Niki and trauma is gut health. And she has phenomenal information about that because I have found that since I was a kid, I have had trouble digesting. And then I later on linked it to violence at home, feeling unsafe, and so on and so forth. So yes, this is how it started. So my first question to Niki, and of course, Niki, feel free to take it however you like. As the abundant energy expert in your practice, you address the importance of identifying and releasing childhood trauma in order to access inner reserves of abundant energy. First, I would like to ask you, how would you define trauma? And second, what would you say are some of the most common causes that prevent people from accessing this energy?
Okay, so yeah, it's very interesting, excuse me, and important work. So the thing is about trauma, it's what traumatizes one person doesn't necessarily traumatize another. So it's any event that happens that at the time we aren't able to kind of consciously process it. So it gets shunted into the unconscious mind and the unconscious body, and the body literally holds the trauma as well. And essentially, from the time that trauma happens, that has a biological impact. It's not just a psychological impact. So, it's very important when, people who've suffered narcissistic abuse in adulthood, they are realizing with help from people like you, Eva, that, there's a root cause to that. And it does usually originate in childhood. And we start to look at how did we attract those types of people into our lives, and then we can sort of look back and discover that we have some self-love deficit, and where did we get that? Why did we attract that? Usually it's caregiver and parental interactions. And what's interesting is that, I came from the background obviously of working with disease and chronic fatigue and so on. The same kind of patterns that would lead somebody from childhood to attract narcissists in adulthood is the same kind of patterns that start to manifest that also develop illness. So we end up as children, when we have trauma, that we have compensating actions that we take for the fact that we do have, a self-love deficit and so on. And one of the things we do is we can become overgivers. We become, we lose ourselves in the process, lose our identity in the process. We can become super achievers. We can become perfectionists. So the same kind of, those traits are very prevalent in people with burnout. They're also very prevalent in people who are codependents, the types that will end up in, a narcissistic relationship. So there was a huge overlap between that. And the key piece, just directly answering your question, when a trauma happens, especially, it doesn't have to be a one-off incident that we can remember, like something like a sexual abuse or something physical. Those are profound and important as well. Narcissistic abuse and just emotional neglect cause a kind of ambient trauma, and you might not actually even have memory of specific incidents, but your biology has changed from the date that trauma happens. Wow. And yes, so it actually changes what we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the way that the adrenal cortisol output responds. And they've done this in animal studies, and they replicated it in adult, in human studies as well, where if you replicate, for example, attachment trauma, so where there isn't bonding between mother and the child, which is a type of ambient trauma, it's precognitive and we probably don't remember that it happened, but it did. Mm-hmm. When you replicate attachment trauma in animal models, you'll see that they actually found the genetic expression of the HPA axis changes for a lifetime. It gets reset. So you need less of a stressor to cause a stress response since the date the trauma happened. So you're already in a state of hypervigilance from that time. So it has all kinds of implications. We're talking about being in fight, flight, or freeze. From the day the trauma happened, and it's a switch, it's a reset in the neuroendocrine immune system, and all of that has like a cascading impact. So the changes that start in the brain, where we're stuck in that fight, flight, hyper stress response, means we're more prone to anxiety, depression. Changes in the body happen like dysbiosis in the gut. So we absolutely know that chronic stress changes the intestinal permeability in the gut, changes the bacterial colonization in the gut, leads on to all kinds of digestive issues. That leads on in adulthood to a link with all autoimmune disorders. That's the link with Hashimoto's and trauma, for example. There's other changes, like we know that trauma suppresses the immune system. So as soon as that happens, you're going to have all kinds of changes. You can go towards the allergic reaction, having more reactions to foods, chemicals, less defense against things like parasites, bacteria, opportunistic infections that can come into play. A lot of it usually does start with digestion, though, I have to say. Yes. It's almost like the gut seems to take the brunt. And we know that, this gut-brain axis there's a really strong correlation, and it's bidirectional. So, and this is really important for trauma, survivors to understand, is that the trauma that happened at the beginning is what changes the biochemistry and the gut. But now the state of your gut is impacting your psychology, because bad bacteria in the gut can lead to, depression and anxiety. Inflammation in the gut leads to depression in adulthood or, in childhood as well. So it's a very, the two things are the same, and they're mirroring each other. So, so important for people to kind of be aware of that and understand that that's how it can lead on to chronic complex illness. And I don't know if we'll talk about the adverse childhood event study, but I'll be guided by you. There's a lot we can talk about.
Oh my God, and we could talk for hours, I have a sense. One thing that really comes to mind is, especially when I have a discussion with my clients about how to quickly at least make like the first shift out of the worst state of mind and body when they're literally drowning in despair, having left an abusive relationship or having realized that they've been lied to. And it's the idea of really paying attention to nutrition, which is a really important self-component. And what you just said, it really validates that, is that when we eat better, and I remember when I was doing my quick recovery, I didn't feel like eating, but I was forcing to drink juices, to eat fruit, to eat veggies, to expose myself to sunlight as much as possible. And I noticed much faster results.
Exactly. And part of recovery we kind of need all the help we can get, right? So, there's psychology work to do and the emotional work and kind of, learning to connect back into feeling self-love again. But, gosh, we need all the help we can get. So things like if you're, in an anxiety and depression that's actually coming from your gut, address that, because it's going to help you lift yourself back into, feeling better again. So, the diet is hugely important, blood sugar control. I can't tell you how important just blood sugar control is. So, people are on this roller coaster where they're actually eating too much carbohydrates, sugar, caffeine. Food can become a big emotional support for us when we're using food to kind of, resolve an emotional state, when really we should be using the tools of emotional intervention rather than diet. So, but it sets us up. So, for example, one of the biggest tips I can give people is like, have a quality protein breakfast in the morning, because it will help set up and balance your energy during the day. If you're missing breakfast, you're eating things like you're having caffeine and sugar to kind of give you a lift, give you energy because you're feeling just really bad. What's happening is you're perpetuating a cycle that you might not realize. You think those things are your friends, but they're not. They're actually knocking you down later in the day. So this is where we can get into adrenal fatigue. And basically when we have the stimulants, it gives us a short-term lift, and then we're absolutely exhausted again. So you're sort of leading into things like insulin resistance, pre-diabetic state, or basically hypoglycemia. What that does is it'll increase your anxiety levels. So you're in this like roller coaster ride. Now you're feeling jittery and anxious because of your blood sugar. You might already be feeling that because you're coming out of trauma. So it's really important that, there's more than one level of the source of anxiety in the body. So sometimes it might be needing to heal a leaky gut. Sometimes we need to address blood sugar issues. Sometimes we need to bring cortisol down. Sometimes people, when they go through trauma, the hormones collapse, their female hormones collapse. If you're a woman, you can suddenly have your progesterone and estrogen and testosterone start to collapse. It's part of the body going into survival, it's going into a survival mode to protect, as a self-protection mechanism. But those hormones affect neurotransmitters. So low hormones leads to low serotonin, low GABA levels, low dopamine levels. So that's affecting our self-confidence, our sense of self-worth. Yes. So you've got this double whammy that you don't forget your biochemistry. You also have this body. And so things like, time in nature is so important. Grounding outside, being connected to the earth. It's free support for you, and it's benevolent nature. It's there to support you. Water is also awesome. Full, going into water and getting into baths, hydrotherapy, spas, all this kind of stuff, I promise you, will help to move emotional energy through as well. Epsom salts baths. I'm trying to give people lots of tips of what they can do.
Thank you.
Sort of right away. But so, I think it's really important for you to understand that exercise, gentle to begin with, is also really important. Like, actually, that will lift your emotional state. It pumps endorphins, the feel good kind of factors that will also help lift you. So putting a kind of program together like that can be a profound help and support, because when your body feels stronger, you'll start to feel stronger, and then you can kind of have this safe container to kind of do some of the deeper emotional work as well. But there's the good news is there's lots of support out there, and getting on the right path. Recovery and overcoming this is totally possible, and there are people like you, helping others how to do that, which I think is awesome.
Thank you, and what you just said really made me also think about how, if there was ever a time, for a person who's really suffering, who's really going through this right now, who's really in the pits of recovery stages, if there's ever time to be really kind to yourself, if there's ever a time to make big changes and big shifts that you ever wanted, like, now is the time, and you can really use it to propel you forward in the most magnificent ways.
Yes, exactly. That's a really good way of using it. Like, it can be the jump point, it can be the trampoline that will help you, lift and reset your life. And these kind of changes, that it's not a temporary fix just to get you over this one thing. It becomes the new person. So we're saying don't become a different person than you were before. So it's like when people ask me, how long do I have to eat vegetables to be healthy for? I'm like, it might be, it's the kind of lifestyle thing. So it's like kind of the lifestyle factors that I just talked about. They can become part of your self-care routine. And now what you often see in kind of burnout, chronic low grade depression and so on is that there's so many signals that we missed, not just about the person that we attracted in. We missed all his or her selfish traits and just signals that we missed. It's also signals about self-care that we missed, that we didn't get that that's part of the neglect from the childhood. So nobody mirrored this to us as a child, that we have emotional, physical needs and that we need the self-care. So we can use this to propel us to create this new way of being. And just doing this, we should talk about what I call daily brain reset rituals as well. We'll talk about those too. They're really important. But it's changing your relationship with yourself, and it's part of learning that self-care process and boundaries, like the boundaries of putting in your protocol of this is what I do on a daily basis. I get up, I do, I don't know, my yoga and meditation routine, I do breathing exercises, then I'll go and do my vegetable juice, and and then you might go outside, get 30 minutes of sunshine every day, time in nature, doing fun things, baths, soul kind of healing stuff. That then becomes an integrated part of who you are. And as you when you can start to feel really good on your own, you'll actually find as you start to work through all this, when you meet someone else who's not resonating at that same level that you've created, you start to see the signals earlier, and you won't make the same mistake in terms of attracting someone like that again. But I should just also mention brain reset rituals.
Please.
Brain reset rituals are really important because normally, there'll be trauma and that you'd have had sort of been reset into this reset of the neuroendocrine immune system, into this kind of hyper stress response. It'll have probably happened even since childhood. There'll have been signs and symptoms likely that, that when you start looking into emotional neglect, you'll start to unfold and start to explore things and realize, wow, I've never felt supported, or I've always had to give myself away or gain approval from others to feel okay and to exist. So, and then you have the event in adulthood, and that's also traumatizing, in addition. So you've got this kind of double whammy that you're playing with. So brain reset rituals are techniques that you need to kind of become part of a way of life that you do on a daily basis that help get you into a safe space. And this is cultivating a safe space inside is so important for feeling calmer, having less anxiety, being able to sleep at night. But it's the basis from which you always want to be able to return to when you start doing sort of the actual trauma work and learning. Is part of the self-love. So you need to be able to sort of create that. And part of it is being able to calm down. So brain reset rituals, one of the most important things you can do that will help calm the nervous system down, help you center and ground, are breathing exercises. They've been around for thousands of years. Just left nostril breathing. It's so simple to do. Just holding off the right nose, left nostril breathing, counting in slowly for 4, inhaling and holding, exhaling for 4. 5 minutes twice a day is actually telling a message to your brain to calm down the nervous system. So, and that's science, like the journal Science just came out and said, hey, we found out why breathing exercises that yogic traditions have said for years actually calms the brain down. And they said there's neurons in the brain that are observing how you breathe. And if you're breathing very high and shallowly, the neurons in the brain go, we're under attack, we're not safe. So then the brain triggers into anxiety. And just anxiety can traumatize, kind of trigger the amygdala again. And you could be in flashback, go straight into a flashback about the events that happened, whether that's adult events or in childhood as well. So breathing exercises are so important. The big ones also are yoga, things like qigong, tai chi. These kinds of practices are fundamental and profound. They're the ones that have the most research showing that they will calm the nervous system down. They have an anti-inflammatory impact. So it's really healing the whole body mind. And yoga is particularly great because, especially yin yoga, where you're actually getting your consciousness into your body again. Grounding is so important. All the anxiety and the stress and the worry and is all here and above very often. It's because our consciousness is shunted up here. Quite often because being here is too painful, the feelings here are too painful, but eventually we slowly need to get back into the body by creating the safe space and breathing back into our physical bodies and bringing your consciousness back in. This is the route through to healing. You know, otherwise you're disassociated, and at some stage, without re-traumatizing, there's a way of connecting back into your emotional self to help release some of the heavier emotions, the shock, kind of, and the grief process that you might go through. So these brain reset rituals, they need to be done daily. It's like sort of saying, oh, I'll eat vegetables for a week and that'll, healthy. They need to become a way of life. So, and it's just finding something joyful that you can do, that you enjoy doing. It's a little bit of discipline required to get into doing a daily routine, but it's foundational for survivors of trauma. I think and you're going to be your energy levels and tendency to depression are going to be affected. So these kind of practices I just listed, fantastic. And just doing anything that you really enjoy. Careful about too much cardio exercise, just because that is actually stressful on the body. It could be another way you're just disassociating and kind of using it almost like if we get addicted using food as well. It's just ways that we are kind of distracting ourselves. So watch out for that as well. Like do the caring, nurturing yin type work.
That is fantastic. And I also just want to add to this that, at least from my own experience, I used to really beat myself up for not meditating 30 minutes a day. And for some reason, it just seemed like infinity. So I started to take it a little bit at a time and actually found that doing meditation between 3 to 6 minutes was plenty. It was enough, because if I did more, I was actually beginning to dissociate and go somewhere else. So like I said, is finding those doses, and sometimes microdoses, is all that's really necessary to make a profound shift.
Yes, really important points. Certain meditations, very mental meditations. Actually, meditation is quite a mental exercise. So I think sensate focusing, which is more of an emotional mindfulness, where you're actually feeling into your body, is good. But yeah, I'm not a huge recommendation of just pure mindfulness meditation for exactly the reason that you said. It's almost like you're just trying to be quiet, and then, the idea is to disassociate from a thought when it comes up, right? So while that is calming to the brain and it can reduce anxiety, it's very easy to go into a transcendent, like actually go out of the body and just avoid and disassociate. And actually that's backed up by amazing people like Ken Wilber, who's like one of the greatest theoretical psychologists ever to walk the planet. And he does say, meditation doesn't make you more aware of your shadow self, or the inner child work. So the inner child shadow work is kind of the bits that we are maybe in denial about or unconscious of, that are actually having a major impact on us and our behavior. But meditation's not the answer. It won't make you more emotionally intelligent. It might make you a bit calmer and a bit more centered, but you can actually, he said there's Tibetan masters that came across in the 60s who were like Zen level, superb meditation masters. And they would quite often, they would still be narcissistically abusive. They had all kinds of inappropriate things they were doing. These were masters. So it's when he came to conclude that, meditation doesn't work on that aspect. So it's not that just pure mindfulness meditation isn't the be all and end all. Like shadow work and the deeper kind of work is going to be more important.
Right. And the fundamentals, which are just making sure you get enough sleep, you get the right nutrition, exactly what you had already alluded to. And what it made me think of, as you were now talking about the mind reset and bringing the mind back into the body, is that over time, as we take better care of ourselves, coming back to the body is going to feel more pleasurable, and we will look forward to it, because the pain would have already alleviated to a certain degree.
Exactly. So, get the stimulants out, get the caffeine out, minimize the alcohol, go organic as much as possible, get nutritious whole foods. But also, she just mentioned about that you just we've touched on it, but circadian rhythm management, I can't tell you how important circadian rhythm management is. And it's just to do with, I actually recommend just try it. People could just try it. Go to bed at 9 p.m. I recommend it's a tip that if you're feeling low energy, depressed, just go to bed at 9 o'clock when it's dark, and just start getting up earlier. Do your protein, breakfast in the morning. I can't tell you how that can change somebody's whole way of being. And if you can't fall asleep at 9 o'clock, do meditations. I mean, like guided visual, kind of feeling-based meditations that are nice and calming. Like with an audio or whatever, until you fall asleep. And then make sure you get bright sunlight during the day. So circadian rhythm mismanagement is one of the most fundamental tools that us practitioners on the health side are now using. It can make such a difference to energy, to your mood. So it's a tip that anybody, I just saw that Dr. Kelly Brogan said, go to bed at 9 o'clock. She's the Manhattan-based holistic psychiatrist. She's like MIT trained. And she just said, just go to bed at 9 o'clock. That was one of her top tips. So there's another one. If you're like up till midnight and, kind of waking up feeling depressed and isolated and so on in the morning, it's part of this self-care routine, getting to bed earlier, getting up earlier. It's going to help that entire stress system, the mood management and so on as well. So, just here's another tip. Giving as many tips as I can.
I love it, and our viewers are gonna love it. And so, what also it made me think of right now, as you were talking about circadian rhythm and watching it kind of like as this sinusoid wave, is that after trauma, especially after we just come out of a traumatic relationship, it's like all of our rhythms are super jagged up and messed up, and it's chaos. So focusing on the biggest one, in a sense, because it's the 24-hour cycle, can help also reset all the other rhythms and set our vibration down to calming and bring us back down to the ground.
Exactly. Yeah. And I recommend people, try it for a week, try to bed 9 o'clock in the morning, 30 minutes of bright sunshine during the day, a high protein breakfast. That's either fish or meat or even, kind of eggs or a protein smoothie. Cut out the caffeine, cut out the alcohol. Even if you just try that for a week, I challenge people to try it for a week. They'll feel so different. Just so notice that you've got these tools that there to help you, and nature and so on as well. So, and be careful who you hang out with as well. It's another big factor.
Huge. It's really pretty much the reason why we're here, right? It's so amazing. I just look out at nature and I'm like, animals are so kind and plants don't hurt us. It's like people hurting people. Which is kind of a perfect segue. I wanted to touch on a topic that really lit up as I was doing research and really partaking in your research on your website. And that is, it's a pretty grim topic. It's a topic of war. And we're living in times where many things are on the edge. And I think it's my own little side commentary, that the more people are cut off from their bodies, are not being present, the more they dissociate, the more we feel like we're living in some kind of a strange video games and are prone to making terrible decisions, right, that affect all of us. So we all need to return to our bodies. But one thing that was really interesting to me is, especially when you were talking about Europe, this was the interview you did with Dr. Zielinski, I believe, and you were talking about how you yourself are from the UK, I'm from Poland, and we've been through a tremendous trauma here, First World War, Second World War, and there was a piece of research that really stood out that talked about the fact that this trauma gets lodged in our cells and it lasts for about 3 generations before it is diluted, meaning that I, within myself, within my body, can carry some of the trauma that my grandmother had been through during the war. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a growing area of understanding that trauma is intergenerationally inherited. So the incidents that happen to our grandparents changes the epigenetic expression biologically and psychologically in their lifetime. And amazingly, the research is showing that change in genetic expression does get passed down, so that we inherit genes that are expressing differently, more towards, you know, an expression of exposure to trauma. So a lot of this started with looking at survivors of the Holocaust. So third generation survivors of the Holocaust victims have the same psychological and physiological changes as their grandparents who were in the Holocaust. And we've got like mainstream journals now they're looking at sort of animal experiments again, but you can actually, if you have traumatized male mice, they've seen that the sperm RNA expression is different. It's expressing differently. If you take that sperm and inject it into healthy female eggs, it will, the progeny have the expression of the trauma. So it actually passes down both the female and the male line, but that's one of the ways it gets passed down. So on this male line, there are research now showing it goes down 7 to 12 generations of progeny. So this is another really important thing for people to be aware of. Like when you start looking back at your own childhood and you're looking for signs of trauma, you might not see anything that obvious, but have a check through and ask your own family. If you ask, you might find out things. Most people find out things they would never have known if they didn't ask. So it's finding out what happened in your own. It might be something that happened to your mother or father that they haven't even talked about. They didn't think to talk about or didn't want to. So it's not just wars and famines. Wherever there's huge wars and famines, you'll see this in the progeny. But it's also what's happening in your own biological lineage as well. So, you know, when you see, usually if you've attracted a narcissist in your current life, quite often you might have one parent that's a narcissist, then you'll find out that their parent rejected them. So you just see this is passing down. And I think it's good for people to know that when you're healing this, you're healing it for your entire ancestral lineage. So that's, you know, to kind of take heart and honor that.
It's a big job.
It's a big job, and it's epidemic. There's so much of it. So we're kind of here to help this. It's so, you know, we could talk about statistics and it might help people to understand how prevalent it is. But also you're stopping that being passed down to your generations and your future sort of progeny as well. It's worth mentioning is a particular type of therapy that specifically deals with intergenerationally inherited trauma, which I really recommend people do if you sense that's had an impact on you, and that's constellations therapy. It was specifically designed. It was Bert Hellinger, I think he was a German psychoanalyst, and he works very energetically, and it's a beautiful therapy. It's a group therapy. So if you look up constellations therapy, Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt does great work with that. So you'd work in a group environment and actually clear things. It's amazing work. It's quite stunning things happen. Like you can be working in the group, and then suddenly, you know, a long lost person you haven't had any contact with in your family calls you on the day you did the work because you've energetically changed the sort of the system that you're in, and it's impacted everybody in your family. And that's also worth bearing in mind. When you do this work, you'll often find it does change the relationships with the rest of your family as well. You know, within reason, some people aren't reachable in this lifetime, you know, and it's best to let that go. With some people, it's the most healthy thing to do. But so the intergenerational aspect is also birth trauma, and also what's going on while your mother is pregnant with you. That all is passed on. What happens in utero, the trauma, anything, whether she was stressed, going through a massive breakup, those kind of her emotions. We're just in a ball of emotion. Before the age of 4, we don't have the cognitive side hasn't come online. We're just a ball of emotion that absorbs, you know, information energetically and emotionally, and we get messages from that age as well. In fact, I think Dr. Bruce Lipton would actually say that's where most of the trauma comes from. It is this attachment trauma, and it's coming from bonding and the messages we're getting at this very subconscious level at that stage. But yeah, in utero as well is also where this is kind of passing on intergenerationally. But yeah, it's a hugely interesting and important area to consider. It also helps take off the self-blame of like, oh, it's all my fault. I'm just a terrible person. I keep attracting all these people. Wow, you know, just understand it would have come from your whole family lineage, and you know, and it's so prevalent. So
yeah, this is huge what you're saying right now, also because there is this component of self-responsibility that comes in with healing. I just find that you can't really it can't fully kick in until after you become aware of what has happened. Because prior to that, we dwell in this kind of semi-conscious state of almost like dwelling in a dream and wondering like, why is this happening to me? And it isn't until we get enough information coupled with self-knowledge and self-care that we're able to really realize and get that snapshot, that epiphany of why this happened. And from this moment on, the game changes forever.
Yeah, and it reminds me of something an important point that I wanted to make, specifically about narcissistic abuse. Narcissistic abuse, it's been so invisible because we're not an emotionally intelligent society. I mean, people look at diet and what's going on with like the standard American diet, for example. I mean, it's horrendous. That is nothing compared to the awareness of emotional intelligence, and how humans treat each other and how connected they are to their emotional selves and self-love. And I think one of the things I just wanted to share about with the narcissistic element of trauma, that type of trauma, it's so invisible, and it's like there's this kind of hardy group of people right now that a lot of them are watching on YouTube, listening to people like you who are sort of waking up going, what the hell just happened to me, right? And the problem is we don't have what there's in the literature, in the research, there's been this whole focus around trauma, around PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. And even that took a long time for the powers that be to recognize that it even existed in response to people coming out of war, which is kind of, I mean, that's psychopathic in itself, isn't it? Kind of not thinking that, humans would be affected by a war situation. Then they might develop something called post-traumatic stress disorder. It was only just recognized relatively recently because of psychiatrists pushing it. Right. So, but post-traumatic stress disorder is not the same as attachment trauma and what people get when they end up with narcissistic abuse. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, it usually is in response to a single discrete event, or a number of discrete events that you can remember, that's usually physical, that you can see it, you can touch it. It was, whether that was sexual abuse or physical abuse. The fact is that the therapist is important people to know. They may know already, but just to re-emphasize it, the whole groups of therapists realizing that we could have had parents that weren't even alcoholics. They gave us physical shelter, physical support, money that we needed, whether we went to college, whatever it was. They were there supporting us in physical ways. There was no substance abuse going on in the household. And yet there are psychologists and so on realizing that there's this group of people that have the same expression of trauma as people who are adult children of alcoholics or, other abuse. And it's the group of people that have had what we're now terming narcissistic abuse. And, it's emotional abuse and neglect. And it is not recognized in the psychiatric community. It developed attachment trauma, which is just a lack of emotional connection, leads to developmental trauma, which is, and if you speak to people like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's the world leading expert on trauma, he's the head of psychiatry at Boston Medical School, and he says the vast majority of trauma isn't PTSD, it's in relation to it's relational trauma, it's attachment trauma, it's how we relate to our parents and how our parents related to us. There's the adult interview for attachment trauma questionnaire that will be certain by it's got 80% accuracy that how you attach with your parent is how you're going to attach in your romantic relationships.
Wow.
With there's an adult attachment interview that you can do, and you can see, okay, if I'm an avoidant type, which is sort of more on the narcissism type, you can just ask how your childhood was, and you'll see it all kind of leads on. So the types of symptoms of developmental trauma are different than PTSD. PTSD is more where you get the kind of flashbacks. There is anxiety, there's kind of trigger events and so on. And there's, poor sleep and so on. Developmental trauma is different. When you have this kind of ambient relational trauma, it's kind of invisible. There's nothing physical that necessarily happened. It's just something like feeling, it's more you'd have difficulty with self-regulation of anxiety, depression, cognitive, it leads to ADHD, bipolar, it leads to most of the mental kind of illnesses that you can see. and the milder forms, and it leads to relational issues, difficulty creating bonded relationships where we either lose ourselves and our identity in the relationship, or we're actually pushing the other person away and intimidating them, making them feel so that's sort of the vast majority is attachment and relational trauma. And I remember listening, there's other people sort of online who talk about this. I think I heard Teal Swans, who's another a very interesting trauma expert as well. And she said she was, I think, a survivor of 10 years of ritualistic abuse, like sexual ritualistic abuse, 10 years, I think, between the age of 10 and 20. And she says, and I've heard it multiple times of people who specialize in complex trauma, which is more this attachment trauma type. It's the emotional neglect and the emotional trauma, which is the most painful, the most difficult to work on. She says the physical stuff's easier. Yeah, not easy, easier. The physical stuff, because you have, yes. So it's such it screws with your mind when it's been narcissistic, but then we're waking up. And this is speaking to what you're saying, like there's this whole bunch of us that are kind of waking up going, there's something going on here that has been below the surface. I mean, there's so much sexual abuse that's going unreported, and the paedophilia, I think we're just at the beginning of unearthing what's happening in that environment, which is a whole thing in itself. But there's an emotional waking. There's a rising in consciousness happening, and there's an emotional awakening happening to this emotional neglect and abuse, this kind of something that we've ignored, downplayed. But, humans at their essence, we're emotional beings. And it's why John Bradshaw, who's the founding father of the inner child work, calls it soul murder. When you've had emotional neglect and abuse, it's a form of soul murder. Well, that's what's happened. I think most people will relate to feeling like when they had that narcissistic abuse, it was a form of soul murder. Right. And I actually think that's far worse. It's harder to get your head around, harder to recover from, harder to recognize, because it just there's the societal support for it, isn't there? Just being like more soft and loving, and all of those things are kind of, society doesn't value it and doesn't even recognize it. So, by the way, developmental trauma is not recognized yet by the American Psychiatric Association. And the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Diagnosing Mental Illness, for example, if people understood about adverse childhood events and ACEs, the DMV that book would just disappear, because it's just all adaptions to what happened to us.
Coping mechanisms, right?
And loads of illnesses like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. If you have fibromyalgia, it's if you don't have trauma, you don't have fibromyalgia. That's what some of the leading diagnosticians are saying now about fibromyalgia. That is a state where we have the trauma, we literally hold it, and it gets frozen into our system. And, our body reflects that emotional pain with physical pain. That's essentially kind of what's happening. So with chronic fatigue, it's the same kind of thing. We kind of shut down to the world because we've burnt out in the process, constantly never-ending kind of giving out to the world, and we've been running on empty. It's just totally running on empty because of the emotional neglect. Very important book, by the way, Running on Empty by Dr. John East Webb. Hugely recommend that book as well. So for people, because she's one of the researchers, who starting to talk about this. Being the emotional neglect is, I think, at the core of a lot of stuff of when people, especially. It can be shocking if you've had a lot of trauma and it's physical as well. It's kind of, there's more understanding there, whereas it can be much more of a mind-blowing experience to have, you sort of, you had that physical support and you were okay in childhood, so you thought, and then you get narcissistic abuse in adulthood. It's kind of more surreal, right? It's kind of even more, it knocks you off your feet.
Right. So our job is to kind of put all the pieces together in order to have that moment of clarity and realize, that you've been put in a situation, you've been born into a situation that really wasn't your fault, but had tremendous repercussions into the way that you felt and developed, right?
Yes, and ultimately it's that unpicking process of kind of, going back into childhood and recognizing all the ways that it kind of that it wasn't your fault, and all the ways that you kind of would have given yourself away, or, conclusions that you drew about yourself, your self-worth, what you needed to do to be okay in the world, especially around other people. And it's going back and actually realizing, okay, that that wasn't my fault. Actually, it was my parents. And you do need to go through that process of getting really angry about, kind of what happened, and connect back into the real sense of, that's a very important part of this work as well. So we've touched on the emotional side, but yeah, it's all connected with the physical body as well. It's kind of the mind and body are one thing.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So it sounds like we have so much work to do. It's like we're just beginning to really talk about this, and this is an epidemic. It's getting worse. So just want to give a shout out to anyone watching and who has, if you've been really interested in this topic and you have been wondering what you can do with your life, what's your purpose? I mean, we're welcoming you. We need more help. We need more researchers. We need more people in this field to spread this information. So to wrap up, I mean, again, we could talk for hours, but to wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what would you say is the most empowering thing that a person suffering from narcissistic abuse, who's waking up to it or who's been processing through it, maybe feeling stuck at some level, what is the mindset that they could get into or absorb or open themselves up to that is going to be empowering to them and make them realize that they're really doing an important work? And this has the power to change their life and influence their life in the most positive way.
Yeah, I mean, the whole sort of incident can be a huge wake-up call, I guess. I'm not meaning that in a judgmental way, but it can be a huge opener to increased joy and love and understanding, ultimately kind of getting more in touch with the essence of who we really are, which are we're feeling emotional sensate beings. We're capable of great love for ourselves and others. And it's sort of this event that happened can be used as a trigger to help. It's like a petal. We're unpicking bringing each of the petal leaves down to expose the essence of what's there. When you take all these blocks out, when you start doing the investigation work, when it's almost starting to retell the story of your childhood as well, where I think that process, part of that is an important process of then finally concluding that underneath, you are lovable, that you are love, and actually that you, as a codependent, I mean, we're mostly talking to the codependents here, right? Because the narcissists aren't listening to this, or they're complaining or probably judging this if they are. But the codependents are some of the most empathic, gifted individuals. I've seen people, and empaths are attracted to narcissists like moths to a flame. This is what Dr. Judith Orloff, who was the assistant professor of psychiatry, said to me in a summit interview I did with her. She said, empaths and narcissists attracted like moths to a flame. And actually, it's understanding that quite often you're the most gifted ones out there, in terms of your empathy, the sense of emotional connection you have. You're able to you'll be able to surpass what other people can do in society. And I'm not kidding about that. If you learn that, it's learning who you are, like what make and model did you show up with, and there's even research showing, I should just mention this because it's so awesome. There's research showing, I've started to talk about dandelions and orchids because there's a provocative theory of genetics showing that there's basically some people are like dandelions. You can kind of throw the seed in any environment and they're pretty hardy and they can develop and survive in any environment and they will bloom. Some of us are more like orchids. We're a little bit more sensitive, we're a little more fragile, and we need the greenhouse care. Now, there's about 15% of the population that have these orchid genes that makes them more sensitive, that they're the highly sensitive types. They're the empaths. They're the and it's no wonder this is the group that's waking up and connecting on YouTube and looking at all this stuff about narcissism, because they're waking up to going, oh my God, something is not right here, because they're the most sensitive. Now, the amazing thing is the researchers originally thought, oh, maybe these genes are just, they're a bit of a liability. It was like, oh God, we need greenhouse care. We need all this extra kind of care and attention. Maybe that's just a limitation. Anyway, there's a revolution in understanding coming about, because when you give the greenhouse care to an orchid type gene person, they surpass the dandelions. They become more successful, and they've done it with children. They've actually tested the children's genes. They've sort of created environments, changed the environment, and they've seen that the orchid children become the greatest kind of sort of elements of society. They help others. They're more successful than the dandelions. So I talk about Ferraris and Land Rovers. Like Land Rovers, you can drive off road and they're pretty hardy. Ferrari, you can't do that. You'll do damage. But you can go at 200 miles an hour, and a Land Rover can't do that down a straight road, right? So, it's coming to coming. That was a big part of me, because I have experienced narcissistic abuse. So it's a big part of what I've been recovering from. It's actually it's part of my journey. The narcissistic side, the trauma, all the other types of trauma in relation to health came through the chronic fatigue side. But it was part of the recovery was realizing I was an empath, and that I had a gifted set of skills in terms of in tuning emotionally to other people and to myself. So, we were the more sensitive types. We're the highly sensitive types, and that comes with liability, but it comes, as a great gift as well. And so, learning to, embrace that, and you need the extra care. So that's just the message to take away. And you'll start to realize that really the essence of human is that we are love. I know that sounds like spiritual, but at the essence, when you peel it all back, you peel the layers back of trauma, of pain, of the neglect, and you keep coming back, and then essentially you're looking for that essential essence that, like, wow, maybe you even came into this planet to help the planet awaken, and that's why you came in and put yourself through it all, to actually go through it. Kind of crazy that masochists that we are, we came into the planet. We came into the planet to go through this, to then show others, because we could wake up faster, to then be able to put the beacon up and go, hey guys, there's something that's missing here, and this is what's appropriate, and this is what's not appropriate. And so that's really how I sort of perceive what's happened, and for people to kind of know, you can recover. It can be incredibly painful, but there probably isn't any more work that you could do that's more important than this. I think in human development, there's nothing that's more important than this work, because it leads you to self-love, and there's nothing else more important than that. So perhaps that can help people feel a little bit more.
I love it. And it's also, I look at it as a form of training. It's like a Spartan training. We get so strong and then are able to face all of this adversity. And like you said, be that beacon of light to say, guys, there's a better way to do this for all. Better way for all.
And redefining strength. So strength doesn't mean putting people down, selfishness, treating people badly. A strength to open up, to live again. A strength is opening your heart again to yourself and others again. Having the strength to go forward and doing what you're doing, just starting a YouTube channel and getting out there and talking about it. And, that's the strength of, a new form of strength, so it's amazing what you're doing. So thank you for what you're doing as well.
Oh no, thank you, and thank you so much for your time. I just wanted to mention to everyone, please check out Niki's website. It's phenomenal. There's so many blogs, fantastic information. She also has a free ebook for download. Niki, would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we didn't talk about it this time, but I talk a lot about the Adverse Childhood Event Study, which is a huge study of 17,500 adults where they looked at trauma in childhood and correlated with adult onset illness. So 67% of all adults have had trauma, and that was an underestimate. And there's a huge correlation. Like if you have ACEs, they're called Adverse Childhood Events, ACEs. If you have a lot, you have an increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. If you have moderate level of ACEs, you have a 20-year reduction in lifespan. So based on that, I talk a lot about that from the health perspective, but my book, which is the 7 Steps to Healing from Trauma and Rebuilding Resilience, I talk about that study, and then there's the 7 steps of recovery. So, and it leads into a lot of all the sort of physical work as well as the psychology work and support out there. So, and people can just sign up. Just go onto my website, nikigratrix.com, nikigratrix.com. Just go onto that website and you can it's on the homepage. And you can also do your ACE score if you're interested to look back.
That was great.
It takes you on a whole journey, because we get past the superficiality of it, and then it leads into going into the attachment trauma, which is getting ignored. So, so I welcome people to sign up for that. It's all free.
Thank you so much. And I'll provide links down below. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Niki, for doing this fantastic work. You're really helping to make the world a better place. And I hope we will have another chance to talk a little bit more on different topics, also, of course, related to the work that we love to do here on planet Earth. And again, thank you. Have a most wonderful rest of your day. And hopefully we'll connect soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.